Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the Q&A part of the Ecsite webinar we had 2 weeks ago on the 13th of May on the topic of decolonizing museums and science communication. You had a lot of great questions, and unfortunately we could not cover them all during the webinar, so we will try to get to those questions now. So one of the questions that we had was, should human remains, that is mummies, be reinterred in their country of origin? This was a question that occurred during Bärbel's talk, so I'd like to invite Bärbel to give us a few of her ideas on that.
My talk was not about human remains, but sure, I have as director of a Human Evolution Museum a stand on this. For me, it's hard to think to reinter human remains, because the human remains are really important historic resources. If without human remains, we would not know anything about human evolution. And even younger human remains from younger centuries, which are not like millions of years of our ancestors, they can tell so much about how people lived, which illnesses they suffered, if there were gender gaps and so on. So I would I know it's a religious task in some countries, but for me it's yeah, hard to imagine to reinter human remains.
Micah, I believe you would like to add something to that.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I come at it from a different perspective than Bärbel, and that is that in any circumstance where a descendant community can be identified, that descendant community needs to be consulted to determine what the appropriate steps are to take with human remains that in many cases scientists have sort of been hoarding for decades, if not longer. For many Native and Indigenous peoples, of course, the relationship with one's ancestors is very different from many Euro-American perspectives in terms of what that looks and feels like. And for many Native and Indigenous peoples, they are part and parcel of everyday life from a kinship perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from a ritual perspective. And the pain and suffering that the scientific community sort of unwittingly, I think, in many cases inflicts on Native peoples is extraordinary from an Indigenous perspective, that you know, somebody's direct ancestor is being sort of held for scientific purposes, not to understate the importance of the information that has come from that, but it comes at an extraordinary cost to other peoples. And so if we are to really take issues of decolonization seriously, I think that has to be a fundamental starting point and a shift in the way that scientists generally look at issues of ancestral remains as not the possession of the scientists and the property of the scientists, but rather an integral part of showing respect and dignity for Indigenous peoples when, again, there can be some sort of descendant community that is identified from those remains.
Thank you, Micah. During appropriations for this session, you particularly talked about some of the obstacles that you were facing in your decolonization work, which I found highly interesting working for an ethnological museum myself. Could you comment on that? And so who is trying to keep you from decolonizing your work? How do they do that?
What we find is that at first blush, initially, when people encounter these ideas, they are very prickly to them and can feel threatened and defensive. And I think that's in some ways a natural reaction. Even the word decolonization is intimidating for many, many people. They have no idea what it means. I can't say I knew what it meant before we started going down this path. And it's loaded, it's packed, it triggers a lot of different things. And so we've worked very carefully to sort of think about how do we present these types of ideas as an invitation into a conversation to try to transcend some of that initial defensive and threatened reaction. Our visitors are often sort of thrown for a loop. Where are the mummies? Where are the shrunken heads? That's why I came here. Those are so cool. And we have to sort of be positioned to explain to them why, if that were your grandmother or your daughter or your father or your brother, how that might feel to you to have your relatives on display without your permission, and the dehumanizing aspect of that. So that's an issue. In the United States, of course, philanthropy is so important for subsidizing what we do. And just like the general public, many philanthropists love the Museum of Man of the past and years ago, where they saw the mummies and the shrunken heads and the stereotypical representations of Native Indigenous peoples as an other that sort of could be appropriated in many ways, and then going on about your own business without thinking about the impact. So we've also had to acclimate our donors in many ways, and we have lost donors, no doubt, who just don't believe that this is sort of the way to go. A key to this was sort of setting the table with our board, so that the board knew that this was a long journey, and that they are committed to playing the long game, so that as we experience these bumps in the road where a donor withdraws from the museum or a visitor makes a negative comment, the board doesn't get nervous and want to change directions. That they understand that there will be a lot of bumps in the road, but that we also are creating a groundswell of support from new donors and visitors who have these aha moments that end up saying, wow, I never thought of it that way before. Thank you for challenging my assumptions and helping me see it through a little bit of a different lens. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, thank you, Micah. Elizabeth, I think you work with European or other museums and help them in the decolonization work. Could you talk a bit about that?
I'm so glad to be following Micah on this, because Micah has shared the challenge at an institutional level and implications of funding. And my experience has been, certainly in the European arena, that some of these institutional challenges could actually be overcome by national leadership in terms of having a national conversation to say, how did these things get here? What is our role in this? What role have we played, for good or for bad? And what you find that that does is it liberates institutional leaders like Micah and other staff within these institutions at individual institutional frameworks to say, you know what? We can be part of a national conversation. So it's not, it becomes then less defensive. Attitudes are a bit more open-minded. And the example I was giving here at the discussion was the example in France, where you have a president that has made a political leadership and has actually opened the ground to have a national conversation across the whole of institutions in France to say, as a country, we are going to deal with this. We are going to move from pseudo-historical memory. We are going to move from myths and falsehoods. We are actually going to address this issue without being defensive about it. And there will be win-wins and there will be some win-loses, but we are going to have a national conversation. And as soon as that happened, it was like, you know, all these institutional leaders just sort of exhaled. You could feel that collective exhalation of breath across French institutions to say, great, now I can be part of a conversation. I am not on my own. I'm not in a defensive situation. I am empowered. Are you with me? I am empowered by my president, by my national political leadership to be able to take this on. And I can then enroll the junior staff, my funders, our stakeholders within that conversation. So I think that we must not underestimate the desperate need that institutional leaders like Micah need to center the whole decolonization drive within some sort of national political leadership. Because we know that that is the real history, the real story, the real framework in which all these collections have ended up in your institutions. They didn't just come out of thin air. There was a political context to how they got there. And that political context is part of the problem, and it has to be part of the solution. And if we can break that logjam, we will break one of the biggest obstacles to decolonization work.
So it's up to us to vote good governments into positions who are open to having those conversations with us.
If it's not there, then you start bottom up, like Micah is doing. You work with what you have. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bottom up also can help as well as top down. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. This is a question to all of you. What would you suggest as a starting point for science communicators for addressing these issues of decolonization, perhaps even beyond the museum context? Maybe Caroline, you want to start?
Well, I agree with the answer that was also written during we talked on the platform. I think it's very important to develop places for reflective practices. I don't know if it's the right place, but I think it might be. It's just wanted to share about the School for Science Facilitation that was launched at Universcience, which is together with partners such as universities, associations, centers for training courses. The aim of this is to bring awareness about the situation, the professional situation of science explainers, to conduct studies and to co-construct projects. And I think it's important to have a place where we can step back and reflect on our practices. The association TRAS, which is part of the inclusion group of Ecsite, delivered a workshop in this Science for School Facilitation. And I'm sure this topic could be more advanced in this school, for instance.
Okay. Who would like to follow on that? How about Bärbel?
It's like diversity. You have to have it in the DNA of your institution, and you have to implement it in your staff concerning your visitors, but also beyond the museum, to go out to different people, to like I showed in my talk, change the advertisement. Who do you address outside? What language do you use? And yeah, it is. You have to widen your horizon to get it really into every topic of your institution.
Liz, you would like to follow?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think following Bärbel, the answer really is, again, sorry to use an old tried and tested approach. It's about mainstreaming. It's about mainstreaming the whole concept of decolonization into your whole macro horizon, as Bärbel has said. It's about mainstreaming decolonization thinking, the same way you mainstream gender, the same way you mainstream other aspects of inequalities and disadvantage. And I think if you come into this as an institution with the humility that recognizes that everything that you do in science communication has got to address decolonization as one of your key mainstreaming parameters, then you create a conducive and enabling environment for all the staff of your institutions, for your visitors, for your funders to be enrolled. And the key word here is enrollment. It's not just for one person to be passionate about it. It's about enrolling your whole organization and your stakeholders through mainstreaming. That's the sustainable way So you don't end up with one champion, and if that champion leaves, we see this all the time in institutions. Once that person leaves, then the whole thing falls by the wayside.
Okay. Micah, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, building on what Liz was saying, and also Bärbel, in terms of how it has to permeate the entire organization and sort of mainstreaming. You know, we've been an organization that has been out front on these issues in the United States, and we see ourselves sort of as out on a branch on a tree, and we're perilously close to the tree, the branch breaking and us falling down in pieces at the bottom. And we want to be out strong enough so that others are sort of saying, wow, there's something to that. In the United States, and eventually the branch gets stronger and stronger and becomes its own tree, right? In the United States, there is the American Alliance of Museums, and they have an accreditation process for our museums. I imagine for you folks in Europe and Africa and elsewhere, there may be either it's ICOM or some sort of body that sort of blesses. And one of the things I think that we want to be working toward for a long-term goal is to get organizations like AAM that really set the standard for what that national kind of discourse is, and the mainstream is just as you'd have certain things in place in order to be accredited relative to your cultural resources care or your exhibits or your facilities. There is also a set of criteria that identifies that museums who are accredited must be doing something in the space of decolonization, whatever that looks like. And it doesn't mean they have to go from 0 to 60 overnight to be accredited, but there's a process that legitimizes that this is part of who we need to be as a field going forward. So I think that's something that could happen not just at AAM, but at our brother and sister organizations that sort of set the standards throughout the world.
Thank you. Liz, the next question is for you, but I think you've already answered large parts of it. The question was, how do you effectively repatriate power and gaze within institutional museum infrastructures? Could you maybe just add a bit of what was missing in your last very good specific answer?
I think I wanted to approach this from a practical solution perspective, particularly for European museums as well as for North American museums, because there's a critical group that could be very useful to repatriating power and gaze within institutions. And I'm talking about a group of what I would call critical friends that all these museums need to have. We have over time, historically and growing contemporarily, a large diaspora group, populations in Europe, in North America. There is no part of the global South that does not have a large representative diaspora population in the global North. Why are you not working with those groups, using them to gain that, what someone talked about, shared cultural knowledge, to gain the background information as to where these collections have come from? And it's best to do that without waiting until there's a crisis. And then it begins to feel like tokenism. Are you with me? Build those relationships and build those partnerships so that you have that indigenous knowledge to tap onto. These populations are right there on your doorstep. You're not having to take a trip to the African continent or having to take a trip to Asia. Use those diaspora populations, and that is also how you grow your diverse audiences as well within your communities, and you become a museum, a science center that really serves all of the communities in your locality, and you become more inclusive.
Thank you, Liz. That is, of course, what we have to do. Talking about diversity, Bärbel, there was a question to you during the talk concerning some of the pictures you showed. I think that was concerning the pictures from the Gucci shoot. Do you have people of color on your staff? Who helps you let's say, make more interesting new mistakes in the future? Because we all know that we will continue making mistakes, just so silly to repeat the old ones.
Yeah, when looking for job applicants, I have to say, fortunately or unfortunately, our team is rather young. I'm with about 50 years. I'm the oldest one in our team. So we don't look for applicants very often. But when we do, now we changed the formulation of the job, how do you call it, advertisement, to look for people of diverse backgrounds. But it is hard. Now, for example, we are looking for an archaeologist for working with us in the collections, but there's very few applicants with a migrant or diverse background. Most are, like, archaeology is not that big subject on university, so you may get some, but it's hard. It's hard to get our staff more diverse. At least we start to get this idea in the heads.
Yeah. Well, one of the, let's say, related questions was, can you bring the people from diverse backgrounds to be in your audiences, and also maybe there's a way of, when you have jobs for other people, that you demand that they have a diverse staff, or at least try to have diverse staff. Either Bärbel, you can continue, or I would also like to bring this question to Micah then.
Great.
Yeah, we always try. Yes, we try with the audiences. Also, we try to get them more diverse. We started with different advertisement, talking in the refugee crisis. We had close contact with refugees and started programs with them. We do try, yes, but it is hard because they have other things to do.
Well, yeah. Okay. Micah, what would you like to add?
I would just add, I think the person who is asking this question is really hitting the nail on the head, in terms of it is painfully obvious to Native and Indigenous peoples and to other peoples of color when they go into a mainstream institution, how wrong so many of our practices are, and yet they are so used to kind of biting their lip because it's the and holding their tongue, because it's kind of the air they breathe and the sea we all swim in that kind of creates that environment where, whether it's being pulled over driving while Black, or followed in a department store, or seeing how something's represented in a museum that totally leaves your story out, if not worse, and demeans it. And so I think bringing people of color and Native and Indigenous peoples onto staffs and boards in particular also is really the only way to help people like me know what they don't know, to shine a light in those areas. And that can be, again, triggering of defensive and threatened kind of reactions, or it can be a gift, right? Where you really are open to seeing things from a little bit of a different vantage point, and hearing more and more, and being in a position of power and influence, then wielding that influence in that other sort of direction. So it requires such a commitment, I think, to overcome all the obstacles that Bärbel was mentioning, because most people of color just don't feel welcome in our institutions. So why would they go apply and want to work there and have to play along kind of in that context? So we have to constantly be sending messages that they are wanted, that they are welcome, that they are their perspective is valued, and then constantly be holding space for them to give hard truths and engage in truth telling, and not be shut down.
Yeah. Amparo, I think you wanted to add something to that.
Yes. Well, I'm an immigrant in California, originally from Mexico City. and working in the field and also working with institutions to do this shift. So when I was working, one of my clients, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, they were looking for a Spanish-speaking specialist to deliver the programs. And even though the aquarium has done a great job on engaging the Spanish-speaking audiences, guess what? They were not advertising these positions in the right place where the people who have this background and this passion will learn about this. So yes, we need to create this relationship with the communities, but at the same time, we need to nurture to be in different levels. The diasporas, as Liz was mentioning earlier, they have their own nuances, right? The Latin America diaspora comes from very high skilled people, professionals, from people who come here to the US to work on the fields, on the crops, who have no learning of elementary school. They don't have a GDE, meaning a high school diploma even. So, but you can grow these communities. You can grow these staff from the bottom up. And there are people who are like that, who have power, money to be part of your boards. So it's building this relationship, cultivating it, but also going to the right place where these people are thirst to these opportunities. And it builds up, right? If you have volunteers that are from these groups of immigrants or communities of color or different ethnic backgrounds, then you're gonna continue involving others. Word of mouth, at least in our communities from Latin America, from Mexico, is super powerful. Oh, go there, they're nice, they're good. They will recommend, they go to the doctor that people recommend. They don't go to Yelp to see where is a good rating, you know? So build those relationships is like so key.
Thank you. Micah, one of the questions that I found, let's say, more amusing during our talk was someone was deeply disturbed by the name of your museum. When is it going to be the Museum of Woman?
I can't punt that question to somebody else, huh? I am with you, and I absolutely get that the you know, the name of our institution undercuts the authenticity of so much of the work that we're doing that is so inconsistent with an exclusive name like that. Our organization has been involved in a name change process for, I think it began about 3 years ago. And we've been sort of spinning our wheels and flailing on it despite a lot of energy and resources put into it during that time. And we just had a board meeting on Wednesday, in fact, where we proposed that when we reopen, we reemerge during the sort of portal that the pandemic is with a new name. And while I'm not at liberty to share any more on that, please stay tuned. We hope to be able to get there as soon as possible. So we're fully aware, I agree, and we're working hard to change that.
This is exciting. And another question to Bärbel. Do you face problems talking about evolution? To my, let's say, believing in Germany mind, it was evolution. That's just the US who don't believe in that. Do you face any opposition for that?
Sometimes it's Christian creationists that, like in the US, I think in the US this problem is much stronger, but they are trying to diffuse in Europe and in Germany as well. But this is rather seldom. More often it's Muslim school kids that oppose to when they are given a guided tour through the museum that would say something against evolution.
Okay. So there was a question if there is a network for people like us, museum staff, admins, patrons, to share resources, support, and decolonization efforts. we believe there is nothing just yet, but maybe going with the equity and inclusion at Ecsite group will be the way to go. Do one of you want to add something on that? Oh, Micah can address that.
I wanted to say something on that. Can I come in on that?
Go in.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to say that actually since the webinar, I personally have had a lot of communications from many people who have participated on the webinar, wanting to know about more information and resources. And I think there really is a growing interest in having some sort of network of or coalition of like-minded institutions, so that people can be supported, and there's the phrase that there is strength in numbers, and actually creating this enabling environment from and getting strength from other colleagues, so that people don't feel isolated in their institutions. So it seems to me that there's two ways we can go. We can look at maybe having a separate standalone network on the decolonization agenda, or we could look at the decolonization agenda being a sub-theme, a working group, a sub-working group within the Equity at Ecsite. And again, you know, I think most people would be flexible either way. But one of the things I'm finding very interesting is that there's a lot of folks who are interested in the decolonization agenda who are not necessarily drawn into the broader framework, are you with me, of equity at Ecsite. I find that really interesting, and I'm not sure how you address their particular concerns in terms of wanting to really focus on that decolonization agenda. And I think Micah has also got some ideas on that.
Yeah,
should we hear from Micah?
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Liz. And in fact, Liz and I had a little bit of an exchange about this very sort of topic, being so excited about what each other's organizations are doing in commitment to this area. We have also sort of longed for this network of sorts where people can compare notes and share successes and challenges and strategies, and as Liz pointed out, kind of safety in numbers. We have a couple pending grant requests actually to create some sort of a digital platform that would allow us to gather so many organizations that are starting really to think about this, but are still really on the fringe and at different points in their own institutional trajectory in how they're thinking and working on these issues. And just hearing from all of the colleagues here on this panel, you know, all these new ideas are coming up and new things to think about and ways to incorporate in our work. So we very much hope to be positioned in the next 6 months or so to begin to build that kind of a network and collaboration with others that would be global. And, you know, we'd start with organizations like all of ours that are committed to this work, and bring others into the fold, and come up with a concerted strategy for how that could lead to a real mainstreaming. I would just add that from where I sit, at least in the United States, I do think it's important that it not be a subset of equity work, which has a lot of overlapping aspects to it, but also some very distinct aspects to it, particularly with respect to sort of the question of colonial legacy and how that got played out relative to Indigenous peoples. It is a different monster sort of altogether, even though there are certainly some common aspects, but I think it deserves its own effort and for a wide variety of reasons.
Yeah, thank you.
I really do agree with that analogy there with Micah. I think it deserves to be a separate standalone, yeah, because some of the issues are just so, you know, it's a paradigm shift, are you with me, from some of the other issues that we talk about in equity and inclusion. And I think, yeah, a standalone would be a much more strategic way to go, yeah.
And even though there are commonalities, the Equity at Ecsite group, where I'm part of, we're very open to build those bridges. And in the original format for the conference, we were going to do share space for in the business bistro, etc. So I think that we still have to do those bridges, but have this as a different conversation, because it has other layers of legal issues and such, that equity and inclusion have a different agenda. But also it's maybe this is a time to create this movement also for the decolonization
Yes.
within our Ecsite community. But thank you so much for
Absolutely, and you build bridges between the two, yes, but it needs a strength of its own. Yeah, I see where Micah is coming from. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, we all know that we want to work on decolonization, but then the current pandemic has thrown some, whatever Schraubschlüssel is in English at the moment, I can't find the word, has, well, stopped us from that work in a bit. Caroline, you were supposed to have a program specifically in working, let's say, on decolonization this year, and then COVID-19 came along. Can you talk about how this is throwing wrenches in your wheels? Is that the word?
Take this opportunity to say that since I have talked for the Ecsite webinar, the new dates of the season, the Africa 2020 season, have been announced by the French government. So the season will be postponed to December this year, 2020, until July 2021. So it's with the relief that we have those dates, because we know that we have a date to advance for our project. Yes, it's true that we had to adapt all the programming, but I think also, and I mentioned it within my talk, I think it was also a very good opportunity to show and to change the perspective that we have in France about the continent. We saw the innovation of the African tech. I mentioned Ushahidi, the Kenyan platform, but there are many others. There were many interesting debates that I have followed, calling for a more sustainable globalization. And I really think, I'm convinced that this season can be a starting point to reflect on our relationship in France with Africa, our common history, and about, yes, the issue of decolonization in our institutions. So in a way, it was difficult practically to adapt. And I am lucky because I work in a national museum in France. We are mostly funded by the state, so we could still work on our subjects. I know it's very different in many other countries, starting with the US. We don't have this problematic, at least for the moment here. So. But though it was difficult to adapt, I think it's also very interesting what is happening now. And I think we will have many dialogues to open for this season at Universcience, really.
Very good. We're looking forward to that. So in the next question, Moed Beloma called us out. He said, "We are talking again about a north to south collaboration and how the north is fixing things. What is done to show the south to north contribution to science epistemology? Shouldn't we discuss the dynamic of who civilizes whom and how science was and is still represented as a white Western male?" We've got one of those here. Accomplishment. What is the place of decolonized content in our outrage production? I think that Liz has something to say on that.
Okay. Well, this one is an interesting one, because I felt that going back to the showcasing in the webinar of the Ishango bone and the Benin bronzes as two long-standing examples of very advanced scientific and mathematical knowledge and innovation on the African continent, And we must remember the context of that advanced knowledge. This was at a timeline in history when Europeans were still living in caves. Europe was in its dark ages. The Vikings were raping and pillaging their way through the whole of Northern Europe. And we had such advanced mathematical and scientific knowledge and innovation on the African continent. Now, let's then move to where we are now, where over centuries of colonial rule, Europeans have systematically extracted all that innovation and knowledge assets from African countries to sit in museums in Europe. What did you think that Europe gained? And I asked that question about how we recalibrate the arrogance of enduring Eurocentric hegemony in terms of scientific knowledge. What enhanced leverage did Europeans gain from having acquired African innovation and knowledge assets over such a long period of time? There is this, arrogance that, oh, they just sat on shelves. No. History is about the accumulation and the advancement of knowledge based on acquiring innovation and knowledge assets from others. It's a layering. And conversely, think of the detriment to the African continent over centuries of the profound loss of that whole body, that whole tranche of innovation and knowledge assets. So really, this question is about, we need to recalibrate, folks. We need to recalibrate our narrative, our discourses. We really need to debunk this seemingly enduring myth of Eurocentric hegemony and how the North civilized the South. Because the history, the track record, the evidence tells us that that is not the whole truth. That is not what the timeline of history tells us. That is not what the contestations of colonial rule tells us. And how do we move forward with a recalibrated consensus of equality in dialogue, in narratives, and dare I say, reconciliation? Because reconciliation is about how you grow that consensus. Are you with me? And recalibrating that understanding of a mutual shared growth path. And until we do that, we are not going to really get to the heart of the decolonization agenda. This question is so profound because it sits right at the root and branch of the challenge and the profound nature of the decolonization agenda. Until we do this, we're not going anywhere.
And
Thank you, Liz.
Oh, sorry. It also has some ripple effect on repatriation of the assets of these communities. It's also talking or addressing that how are we gonna incorporate this scientific knowledge in the case of our science centers and cosmovision, right? The origins of the world is very different from our indigenous cultures in Mexico, from the communities in Africa. How the world was conceived and created is not only the creationism of the Christian perspective of a man and a woman made of clay and God and the rib. Yeah, we learned that because the Spaniards came to Mexico, but we have our own narrative of how the world was created and why the calendar is made of those days and what are the seasons going on. And that's a lot of knowledge that if you're gonna keep our cultural assets, you should talk about our scientific knowledge. Just
exactly.
But it's related to all those topics as well.
Yeah. And that's a powerful illustration, Amparo. I mean, I have to say that I talk about Africa because that is the continent that I know about. I'm not one of these people who thinks that I have the platform to talk about Latin America and Asia. I think it's very important that we we have the humility to talk about what our constituency is. So everything I've said about the African continent, we can say about the Latin America, we can say about all the parts of Asia. Are you with me? The same challenges, the same reconciliation, the same debunking of this Eurocentric hegemony, the same addressing of the extraction of these knowledge and innovation assets that have been extracted from all across the global south to the global north. And we now have that being reconstituted into this enduring Eurocentric myth and ideology. And really, it's about time that we change that. So thanks for those examples as well. Yes.
Micah, you would like to add something to that?
Yeah, I really love this conversation and appreciate both of those commentaries. I'm reminded of Audre Lorde's quote that that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, or to quote Jimi Hendrix, that the world will change when the love of power is overcome by the power of love. And you know, both those together, I think, really are indicative of the fact that what we are really talking about is a paradigm shift here that demands sort of transcending everything we know. And so, you know, for example, in our organization, as we're struggling to ask questions about, you know, could we create a consulting practice to help other organizations go down a decolonization path? Well, just the very terminology of consulting and sort of profiteering off of it and is problematic, or this idea of creating a sort of network of like-minded organizations. We're looking at doing that not from the vantage point of us sort of coming in and saying, okay, this is what we need to do, but rather going to organizations who have been doing this work for many, many years, because they're native and indigenous run organizations that have been grappling with these issues. And mainstream organizations like my own are sort of new to the game, but it's been going on forever because it's been so painfully obvious to others. And so really creating new tools that emerge out of the kind of space that Liz is working from, I think are the only way that we're ever going to get to that mainstreamed point in a way that doesn't sort of co-opt and reproduce colonial legacy.
Would it be feasible to ask the question of decolonization of museums in the larger context of the UN SDGs? This would give a framework that is already largely accepted and recognizes the need to include everybody in fighting inequalities, asks Walter Stevelos.
Yes, this is a very good question from Walter. And knowing Walter, I know he always thinks at the strategic level. And yes, in a sense, he is right, because the UN SDGs gives us a global interconnectedness, acknowledging the complex nature of globalized inequalities and making it a global imperative to tackle that. But, and this is the big but, what it doesn't do is to go beyond that, to frame it in terms of the decolonization agenda. But in a sense, the COVID-19 crisis is showing us how that could actually work in a decolonized lens. Because what we are finding is that in response to this crisis, many countries in the global south decided to tap into their own indigenous knowledge and experiences of fighting various pandemics. And they moved very quickly and did things very differently from many countries in the global north. And look how that has paid off for them. So you have a situation where the disease burden is much lower in many countries in Africa and Asia, and the number of deaths is so tiny compared to the global north. So this is a classic example of how the SDGs, if it actually just enabled us to frame development with that decolonized lens, could actually be a much better instrument. And it has happened in COVID-19, and it would be nice to see this decolonized thinking happening in other aspects of the 17 development SDGs.
Okay, thank you, Liz. And the last question that was there in our webinar was if someone of us could give some thoughts about the history and representation of conflict in museums. And Liz, you had said before that you would have something to tell us here.
Yeah, I must admit that I really love this question. It was the one question that made me smile, because the painful truth is there is no such good practice. History of conflict is always written by the victors. It is very, very difficult to find any museum or any place of memory that faithfully and equitably records the history of conflict from the perspectives of the winners as well as the losers. And that is the challenge that we have always faced throughout history. And that feeds directly into the whole decolonization agenda. And that is at the heart of the challenge of decolonization. And this is where false historical memory sits. And I will just summarize this finally with a very wonderful African proverb that we have that says, until the tales of hunting are told by the lions, they will always glorify the hunter. Until the stories of hunting are told by the lions, the hunter will always be glorified. And that really sums up the challenge in one pithy African proverb.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Liz. So I think this can be a good last word. Let's all give voice to the lion, maybe to the gazelles as well, to everyone who is hunted, and decolonize our museums, our communication. Thank you everyone for being here with us, and we hope that we've given you some answers. If not, just contact us and we'll try again. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.